Every glass of wine tells a story. These stories reveal hidden histories, flavors, and passions, and sometimes they unravel our darkest desires. In Wine Enthusiast's newest podcast, Vinfamous, journalist Ashley Smith dissects the underbelly of the wine world. We hear from the people who know what it means when the product of love and care becomes the source of greed, arson, and even murder. Each episode takes listeners into the mysterious and historic world of winemaking and the crimes that have since become Vinfamous. This podcast pairs well with wine lovers, history nerds, and crime junkies alike. So grab a glass of your favorite wine and follow the podcast to join them as they delve into the twists and turns behind the all-time most shocking wine crimes. Follow Vinfamous on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and be sure to follow the show so you never miss a scandal. New episodes drop every other Wednesday.
Modern. We're prepping for a voyage.
Modern.
The force of an old-fashioned equals whiskey mass times bitters acceleration.
Why don't you make that a double?
Modern bar cart.
What's shaking, cocktail fans? Welcome to episode 260 of the Modern Bar Cart podcast. I'm your host, Eric Kozlik. Thanks for joining me for another interview episode where we track down the best and brightest minds in the spirits and cocktail world so that we can share their secrets with you. This time around, I'm joined by my friend, Distiller Mark Vierthaler, whom longtime listeners may remember from episode 121, where he and I talked about the finer points of distilling absinthe. But folks, one thing you should know about Mr. Vierthaler is that he is a Renaissance individual, a dog lover, a motorcycle enthusiast, absinthe connoisseur perhaps, but the story doesn't end there, because this time around, we're here to talk about the American Single Malt category and the fascinating, delicious work that he's doing as head distiller at Whisky Del Bac in Tucson, Arizona. But before we talk about the art and science of mesquite smoked malts, before we measure your phenolic parts per million, check your creosol and guaiacol levels, and slap you in a barrel to soak up a breezy Tucsonian 40-degree diurnal swing, let's take a brief pause so that you can make yourself a drink. This episode's featured cocktail is the South by Southwest. To make it, you'll need 1 ounce or 30 ml of Peated Single Malt Whisky, 1 ounce or 30 ml of Campari or a similar red Italian bitter aperitivo, 1 ounce or 30 ml of your favorite sweet vermouth, and a mist of orange blossom water. Now, if you're worried about picking up this ingredient because you don't know what else to do with it, maybe consider using it in its most famous cocktail application, the Ramos Gin Fizz. Back to the South by Southwest. Using an atomizer, mist the inside of a chilled old-fashioned glass with a few spritzes of orange blossom water. Then, in a mixing glass with ice, combine the other ingredients, stir until well chilled and properly diluted, then strain into your old-fashioned glass over a large rock, garnish with a citrus twist, and enjoy. Developed by Australian bartender Benny McHugh and featured in Gaz Regan's book The Negroni, this cocktail does one better than a simple swap-in Scotch cocktail like the Rob Roy. Instead of settling for that simple swap-in, this drink takes its most ornery ingredient, clearly that peated single malt whiskey. Then it pops its heads out of the weeds and surveys the landscape to determine if there are any techniques that can be pulled in from other cocktail formats that might help acclimatize that naughty ingredient to the Negroni use case. Clearly, it locates that technique in the orange blossom water mist, a kind of Crescent City mashup between the Sazerac absinthe rinse and the aforementioned Ramos bicep workout. What's to love about this? Well, a couple things. One, it clearly balances out the smoky, aggressive notes from the peated single malt with floral, sweet tones that naturally form a bridge to the other two sweetened, aromatized ingredients. And two, it begs the question, is there other stuff we should be doing to our Negronis? I mean, don't get me wrong, I love them classic, I love them spagliatoed, I love them red, and I love them white. In a box, with a fox, etc., etc. But I'm kind of ashamed to admit that in all my Negroni travels, it hasn't once occurred to me to give my glass an aromatized rinse. So I'll leave you with this question. What else are we missing? What other frontiers are we declining to push when it comes to our favorite equal parts libation? Try your hand at the South by Southwest cocktail, tag us on Instagram, and let us know if it inspires you to borrow a lateral technique and create an innovation of your own. So, with a shiny new Negroni riff in hand, let's turn our attention back to the interview. In this Mesquited, not Peated conversation with Whisky Del Bac head distiller Mark Vierthaler, some of the topics we discuss include what it takes for a spirit to be called an American Single Malt Whisky, a term that is currently self-administered by the American Single Malt Whisky Commission, but that's on track for nationwide federal approval and regulation by the TTB. A brief romp through some of the controversies still yet to be resolved regarding the mandatory or prohibited use of certain barrels and finishing techniques. The story of Whisky Del Bac, from esoteric Southwest-inspired furniture to calibrating against an iconic Scotch brand, to releasing some of the most innovative and distinct American single malt offerings on today's market. Mark also walks us through some of the most important process-related decisions he and his team manage, including precise malt smoking, narrow cuts to accommodate small format barrels, and the ever-crucial question of aging in the desert, where temperatures fluctuate aggressively. We wrap up by featuring the offerings in Whisky Del Bac's global cask selection, including their Frontera, Normandy, and Ode to Isla annual bottlings. Along the way, we pen a love letter to the humble javelina, reenact one of the worst drams I've ever had at a bar, try our hand at designing the ultimate distillery cat, and much, much more. All I can say about this one, dear listeners, is that you're in for a real treat. Mark is one of those folks who really walks the walk when it comes to quality, and he manages to do it, as you'll see, without expense to the creative end of the distilling endeavor. We'll be featuring this year's Whisky Del Bac Frontera release in our next new and noteworthy bottle review episode, but for now, please enjoy this deep dive into the world of American single malts with the one and only Mark Vierthaler. Mark, welcome back to the podcast.
It is excellent to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah. So last time you were on the podcast, we were in person. We were live and in person. And we were actually talking about absinthe, which is very, very far away from, I think, many of the things that we'll be talking about in this episode. But I could be wrong. But before we jump into all things American Single Malt, as you mentioned offline, the Desert Southwest and what you're doing these days, can you reintroduce yourself to those listeners who might not have joined us for that initial interview?
Of course. Yeah. So, Mark A. Vierthaler, I am currently, and hopefully for a while, head distiller at Whisky Del Bac here in Tucson, Arizona. As you had kind of mentioned, we pretty much exclusively make American Single Malt Whiskey. We did actually release a rye last fall. That, however, was a sourced product, and we can kind of talk a little bit about that. So last time I was on, I was head distiller of 10th Ward Distilling Company there in Frederick, Maryland. So made a bit of a jump moving from the mid-Atlantic to the desert Southwest. Yeah, I got my start distilling 7 years ago in my hometown of Dodge City, Kansas at Boot Hill Distillery. So that is the cliff notes of how I went from Western Kansas to Maryland to Southwest U.S.
Indeed. Well, it's great to have you back. I know that when we get together, we always have a lot of fun talking tasting notes and process, right? And especially, I feel like you and I both enjoy the intersection of tasting notes and process, right?
Yes.
As tempted as I am, I obviously I did my homework. I did some research on Whisky Del Bac, your current gig, and as tempted as I am to just jump into that story because it's super juicy, as you well know, I think we should do our listeners and actually me a bit of a service here by talking about the American Single Malt category in general. And the reason why I say that is because Well, a couple of things. I had a really great conversation with Lance Winters from St. George Spirits about American Single Malt as a category. And we talked about it at a very sort of zoomed out level. And we were kind of comparing American Single Malt to some of the more old world spirits like traditional single malt, perhaps, or even like French cognac, where there's many more rules involved. And I think we were doing some comparing and contrasting there. But I'd like to actually dig in a little bit more. Like, what is American Single Malt? Like, who's making it? How is it different from bourbon? Like, these are some of the questions that I think it would be great to address for our listeners before we talk about Del Bac in particular.
Yeah, definitely. So American Single Malt, I have a soft spot for kind of self-defining terms, and I feel American Single Malt kind of falls within that up to an extent. But basically, according to the American Single Malt Whisky Commission, which is kind of the self-governing board of American Single Malt producers here in the U.S. right now, for it to be an American Single Malt, the number one thing is, of course, it has to be made 100% in America by a single distillery. It has to have a 100% malted barley base. For those people who are big into whiskey production, it then kind of follows a lot of the traditional American styles of production. It has to come off of your still at 160 proof or below, go into barrels at 125 proof or below. One of the ways, probably one of the biggest ways that we actually break with the other traditional American styles is you don't have to go into brand new oak. And I think one thing we'll talk a little bit about is that is kind of how you will see people start to branch off and really start to make their own impact on the area of American Single Malt whiskey. Because, what I'll always tell people when they'll come in is, we have water, yeast, barley in the barrel. So we have 4 ingredients. But even within those 4 ingredients, there is so much control you can have over and so much impact you can have on final flavor profile. I had mentioned American Single Malt Whisky Commission, kind of the self-regulatory right now. I don't know how deep we want to get into regulatory issues because, that it makes for great listening. But the TTB, which is our regulatory body for distilleries, is in the process of recognizing American Single Malt Whiskey as an actual recognized designation here in the U.S. We had hoped that it would have gone through by this point. It was open for public commentary last year, and while the support has been overwhelming, the last conversations that have been happening with the TTB, they're kind of working through some concerns that other people raised. So fingers crossed, sooner rather than later, though, it will be an actual designation.
Yeah, that's interesting. So a number of things to comment on there. So I like that you were able to call out some of these proof points, right? It needs to be distilled at 160 proof, which is 80% ABV or below, right? And the or below to me is the part that points toward process and eventually flavor profile to me, right? Because if you're putting these things through a, continuous column still, they're generally like when you do go that route and you distill to a super high proof, you're going to be making a product that is vastly different than the outcome that you're aiming for in American Single Malt. So probably not that you would need to tell a bunch of people who are going for that specific outcome that they need to do it, but it's useful to have that. It's useful to have that cutoff, I guess, right?
Right.
Which actually sort of gets sort of divergent from what I was talking about with Lance, which is like the creativity, the wide openness of the landscape. It's interesting as we see more people kind of latch on to this product style, American Single Malt, and want to get it recognized, that suddenly it's like, ooh, no, we actually do want some of these constraints. And it does behoove us as a group to get together and say like, okay, like, yeah, we want our creativity. Maybe we don't ever want to have to, gun to our head, use new charred oak barrels, but maybe we do want to make sure that somebody who's running this stuff through a continuous column still at like 95% ABV isn't able to then slap our value, kind of like our category name on their product, and it seems to me like that would be somewhat misleading. So that's all really good information to have. Do you mind if I maybe probe a little bit into what some of the objections are that the TTB might be considering?
Yeah, so at least, so, I always say take this with a grain of salt. This is what I've heard from people I've chatted with at TTB that they have publicly disclosed. Obviously, them being a government agency, they do keep a lot of this close to their chest. But some of the objections that we've heard have been, one, that there is not a requirement to use a brand new barrel. So bourbon, rye, wheat whiskey, all other American whiskeys other than corn whiskey, you have to use a brand new barrel. So there have been some producers of these other spirits that have said, hey, why do we have to follow this rule and American Single Malt doesn't? The other big controversy has also been coloration. We have, and I say we as in the American Single Malt Whisky Commission, and I should bring this up so I can make sure that I am accurately speaking to it. But one of the things was the ability to put in a small amount of coloration for consistency of color. That has also led to some discussion of, are you being transparent? Can you be adequately, presenting your product if you are using coloration, if you are using caramel coloring, which then can lead into the whole discussion of, well, let's talk about cognac and let's talk about bois and let's talk about, all these other very highly regarded production processes that do allow a little bit of putting your thumb on the scale for consistency. But those, to my knowledge, have been the biggest ones. It's been the coloration and has been utilization of new barrels.
Well, let me give you I'm not going to touch the coloration just because I don't think we've done enough groundwork on, like you said, the adding of like oak extract and the boisé or the dosages of different types, especially as they correspond to straight distillates versus sweetened stuff and all the other nuances there. We haven't covered that in nearly enough depth on the show or personally for me to feel comfortable commenting on that. But when it comes to barrels, I guess my impression, and you can just decide to not touch this impression with a 10-foot pole. But it seems to me that it's a little ironic that there's an outcry from bourbon about the new charred oak barrel thing, because that's kind of their thing. And it seems like, well, it almost seems to me to be like I want to have my thing, but I don't want you to have your thing. And so I don't know. I'm not quite sure. I guess I when it comes to the coloration, I can see where that would be a concern in terms of deception. Right. But when it comes to some of the other stuff with the barrels, I just feel like it's like, well, you could just make an American single malt then.
Right. Oh no, 100%. And obviously we're coming at it, and I say we as in myself, Whisky Del Bac, the members of the Single Malt Whisky Commission. We're craft producers. I think Whisky Del Bac, we're a bit of an anomaly in that, like Westland and Westward, we're making American single malt. And so to us, it is that ability to not have that constraint. It is, again, a section that is largely born out of the Scottish single malt movement. And, I don't know. I think I've heard, and this could be apocryphal, that also the reason that there is the new charred oak requirement that was in there for the coopers. and the cooperages were like, well, we need to make sure that we're still getting this. And, I say that not knowing, and having a great amount of respect for the coopers because they make our barrels. And when we get into talking about Whisky Del Bac, we break with the Scottish standard. We do use new charred American white oak for our process. So that is something that we fully support not requiring that, even though that's what we do, because I think that does come back to then allowing that ability to have more nuanced and more adventurous aging processes within American single malt and not being specifically tied to, because new charred oak creates a very distinctive profile. It is a very American profile.
It is. And it's right there in the name, American Single Malt. So we'll leave that there. It's meant to be unresolved, but I think we're gonna maybe revisit some of these specifics as it pertains to like our ability to remix traditional spirits by using potentially, slightly innovative techniques. But I think that's a great entree into Whisky Del Bac. So could you give us the Whisky Del Bac story so that our listeners understand what your brand is doing and how, we've already, kind of explained one way that you guys that stand apart and that you're using these new charred oak barrels, but like what else sets you guys apart from the pack?
Yeah, definitely. So we're recording this in March of 2023. So this is 12 years. We've been open for 12 years, officially opened our doors in 2011. We are founded by Stephen Paul and his daughter, Amanda Paul. It's a super interesting story about how the distillery actually came to be. So Stephen and his wife, Elaine, actually owned a furniture business here in Tucson for 30 years. And they specifically were known for the work that they did with mesquite wood. For those of you who aren't very familiar with mesquite is a native tree shrub that grows, especially within the American Southwest. It is this very striking, very gnarled tree. It also has this beautiful wood grain that is an absolute nightmare to work with. Stephen, who grew up here in Tucson, was very obsessed with this idea of creating furniture that was of the Sonoran Desert. Because it is this very twisted, very gnarled wood, it also produces a lot of waste. There is a lot of scrap that was coming with him back to the house. And I always say I'm contractually obligated to tell this joke, so I will say it. Stephen would bring the chips home. He and his wife Elaine would smoke them in the backyard, and Stephen would say, "There are profits going up in smoke." I've said
Indeed.
it. Yes. But in all seriousness, what had happened was Stephen and Elaine are big Scotch drinkers. And, they would sit out on their back porch and they would sip their Scotch. And Stephen will always say that Elaine is the idea person. And they were drinking Scotch one night and she was like, "Hey, they dry, or, some Scotches dry their malts over a peat fire. Has anyone ever considered doing mesquite instead?" And Stephen kind of got obsessed with this idea and set about teaching himself how to distill and teaching himself how to malt, and started experimenting in the back of his wood shop, and eventually was able to produce a single malt that he felt was good enough that could go to market. And around 2011, his daughter Amanda moved back to Tucson from New York, where she'd been for about 10 years, and was like, "Hey, this is a business. Like, we should make this legitimate. We should see how far we can take this." And so the two of them founded Hamilton Distillers, which is our actual company name, and then Whisky Del Bac is the American Single Malt that we make. And we started with what we call our classic, which is an unsmoked American Single Malt. But what we're most known for is what was born out of this idea of using mesquite for your malt. And so that's our Dorado. And that is what we call a mesquited, not peated, American Single Malt. As I had mentioned, for it to be American Single Malt, we can only use 100% malted barley. But there are so many other things within that subset that we can use. And so for our unsmoked offerings, we do source our malt from just outside of Fort Worth, a malting house called Tex Malt. But for our mesquited malt, we still do malt and smoke that in-house. We are one of the few distilleries in the U.S., especially our size, that does in-house malting. And so that's kind of where Whisky Del Bac was born from, was being able to take this idea of what makes Scottish single malt so good and then really putting a place and a time on it. I will always tell people Whisky Del Bac is of the Sonoran Desert. It is a love letter to Baja, Arizona. And, some people will be like, "Oh, well, maybe you should try and make it taste more like Scotch." And, I'll always say Scotland doesn't apologize for their whiskey tasting like Scottish whiskey. Ireland doesn't. Kentucky doesn't. Why should Arizona apologize for creating a whiskey that is of its place?
Right. First of all, Love the story. It's a great way to resonate with the brand. And I think one of the things that I appreciate most is that you've got the initial idea, the initial nucleus or seed from which this enterprise sprouted was Mesquited, not peated, right? And yet the first product launched was not that. Right.
It was not.
Right. And I think, I don't know, do you think that's important? I think that's important.
I think it's very important because, Stephen will always maintain that, he wanted to have a quality product before he felt he could implement, especially something so at the time off the wall. I mean, there are multiple distilleries that are producing Mesquited products these days. We're also not even the only American Single Malt. Santa Fe Spirits, who we adore, Colin Keegan, they actually were coming up kind of side by side with Whisky Del Bac at the same time, creating a Mesquited American Single Malt. But yeah, Stephen always said he wanted to hit that Macallan 12 quality level, not so much for the flavor profile, but for the quality level. That if he was able to create an unsmoked single malt that could rival that in terms of quality, then he could move on to the next thing.
So what does that mean in the glass and on the palate? The Macallan 12, many will be familiar with it, but what about that? I mean, let's just say people have favorite whiskeys, right? So it's great. So Stephen's got this whiskey that he really enjoys. And I think it's natural to set that as a benchmark, but kind of digging into more of the process things and some of those quality touch points that you're looking for. What does Macallan 12 do particularly well that Whisky Del Bac? I'm guessing it's the original. Does the original have a name?
Well, we call it Classic.
Classic. So the Classic Del Bac.
Yes.
What does that share in common with the Macallan 12?
Wow. So obviously I can't speak for Stephen on what his benchmarks were other than obviously drinkability. I think, and I hate that word. That's such it's just like smooth. Like you hand somebody, they taste something and they're like, oh yeah, that's smooth. But, for me, when I first was introduced to the brand and, I had heard of Del Bac back in Maryland, and I had just never been able to get my hands on a bottle. And so when this conversation started of, me potentially heading out there, I was like, okay, I want to see if I can find this, and was actually able to track down a couple of bottles there in Maryland and brought it back. And while I wouldn't say, again, in terms of flavor profile, that the Classic had this, I wasn't like, oh, that's a Macallan 12. It was accessible. It was... I think people have this idea, especially in the Scotch realm, of it's going to be peated, it's going to be smoky, it's going to have this iodine note, and it's going to be way too punchy, and it's just not going to give me what I think is going to be an enjoyable drinking experience. And the Classic is very much kind of like the Dorado. It is of the Sonoran Desert. It doesn't have those mesquite notes, but it's balanced. It is very chocolatey, but it also, because again, we go into new charred oak, it has these very kind of bourbon-like notes. There's a lot of vanillins. It's very tannic, but I don't know. I guess just accessibility was kind of the first thing that I had when I thought of it, was like, if you wanted to get somebody into American Single Malt, if someone is a bourbon drinker or a rye drinker and they're like, Scotch isn't my thing, Irish whiskey isn't my thing, so I'm assuming American Single Malt is going to track along those lines. Classic kind of hit that sweet spot of being floral and being nuanced that you get from a Scotch, but still being bold and punchy that you expect from an American whiskey.
Right. No, I think that's all useful commentary because, like what I was thinking when you were saying drinkability, it's like, well, there needs to be a certain well-roundedness to it, not necessarily a round or a fat or an unctuous mouthfeel per se. I mean, those can be qualities, but a well-roundedness to the Classic, our keystone, our benchmark product against which all subsequent projects are going to be measured, should be well-rounded. And that doesn't happen most of the time first run through the still. That takes time to adjust. Lots of sourcing considerations, as you mentioned, right? Like if we're using 100% malt, well, maybe we should pay attention to where that comes from. And that, again, you're not overnight going to develop good relationships and, like be able to source the exact thing that is going to, take your product from something that is bought because it's from Arizona versus something that can be successful in outside markets, right? And so that's why I wanted to lean on the fact that they did not just immediately start blasting stuff with mesquite. Now, that said, let's blast some stuff with mesquite. We know, many of us, and love, some of us, the Smoky Highland and Islay and Island whiskeys of Scotland, and many of those are smoked over peat during the malting process. To me, the nerdy term phenolic parts per million comes up. What are some of the similarities between peat smoking and mesquite smoking? And what are some of the differences? One difference, I imagine, might be the environment. I don't know. I'm just picturing like windswept Islay, during a wet storm versus like some steel guitar and it's like dry 90 degrees all day, every day in Arizona. So,
oh man, wow, yeah. So yeah, we can talk about how the aging impacts the flavor profile, and to kind of take it back to that first question of the differences between peating and mesquiting. So obviously, yeah, parts per million. You're looking at phenolic compounds. You're looking at your guaiacol levels, you're looking at your cresol levels. And it's interesting because, peat has this very distinctive Band-Aid, iodine note, that kind of medicinal, that a lot of people don't like and aren't particularly fond of. And I love them. I'm a big fan of heavy peaty. I mean, one of my go-tos is Lefroy quarter cask. And that is just like chewing on a tire fire, and I love it. Mm-hmm. But with mesquite, mesquite's hard to describe because mesquite tastes like mesquite. It is this very distinctive wood that creates a very distinctive flavor profile. From kind of the 5,000 foot view, what you're looking at is mesquite smoke, specifically on malt, creates a bit of a softer, kind of honeyed-like quality to it. Much like peat, though, mesquite is very delicate in terms of overdoing it. If you are not careful with it, it creates this very aggressive, astringent, unbalanced, bitey quality. And we actually have run tests on, because people occasionally ask that, well, what's your parts per million? So we actually ran a sample of our standard Dorado. We sent it off to Hartwick College, their Center for Craft Food and Beverage. And so we had them run a test on that to check our phenol levels against a Lefroy 48%. So what is interesting to look at is our phenol levels for the Dorado are right on par with the Lefroy. And so that's going to be your kind of, distinctive smoky note. The guaiacol, on the other hand, that is almost quadruple in the Lefroy that it is in the Dorado. And so it's kind of cool to be able to kind of look at it and go, oh, well, you want to know where these spikes are from a scientific standpoint. We're looking at a lower level of guaiacol in the Dorado, which does create this kind of softer, rounder mouthfeel from the smoke. But then in terms of aging, yeah, it's, again, I know there are people who bristle at the idea of terroir within whiskey. And I think the idea of being able to taste where this barley was specifically grown, there's a commodification that happens during the distillation process. You are stripping those nuances out. But to me, terroir of whiskey is leaning into the opportunities and challenges of where you live. And so for us, we are in the desert. We are low humidity, high temperature. But on top of that, we have these really aggressive day-to-day shifts. So our diurnal shift, our 24-hour shift, on average is 30 to 40 degrees. So in the winter, I can leave my house to go to the distillery and it's 30 degrees, and I'm leaving the distillery to go home in the afternoon and it's 70. And so if you don't do much of any HVAC, any sort of climate control in your aging space, you're getting a lot of push and pull. Another way to kind of touch on how we break with that Scottish tradition, not only are we using new charred oak, we almost exclusively use quarter casks. We're using 15-gallon barrels. So we have a whole bunch of surface area of our spirit coming into a whole bunch of surface area of the wood. And this will be a digression that you can edit out later if you're like, man, Mark got way into the weeds on this. But a lot of people will try to tell you smaller barrels means faster aging, and that's not true. Smaller barrels means faster extraction. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there who are utilizing small format barrels that don't know how to do it properly. And so you can create really beautiful spirits with small format barrels, with really aggressive aging restrictions, if you know what you're doing. And the biggest thing is just how narrow you make the cuts. So, and again, we can talk about when you're going into a 53-gallon barrel and you know you're going to be able to sit for 5, 6, 10, 20 years, you can make very wide cuts. You can let some of that acetone come off in the heads, and you can let some of those fusel oils start to pull off in the tails. That, as new make, it's not going to taste great. You go into a big barrel, you let it sit, it's going to esterize, you're going to get these very beautiful flavors that come out. You can't do that in small barrels. You don't have the time to do that, because if you let a small barrel over extract, it's like over soaking a tea bag. It just becomes really bitter, really astringent, really unpleasant. So a lot of people are surprised to learn average age of our core products, our Classic and Dorado, is 12 months. Like, we are able to get these very nuanced, very beautiful whiskeys in a short amount of time because we're focusing on those constraints versus kind of just being like, well, how you do it for 53 is how you do it for 30, which is how you do it for 15.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the barrel, like you said earlier, cooperage can be a tricky thing. It's to me one of the implicit value judgments that accompanies many whiskey enthusiasts at sort of like I do this at home, but not professionally level, is that the older something is, the better it is.
Right.
I just as a slight anecdote to illustrate this. I went to a very, very well-known, prestigious rum bar. I'm not even going to tell you what state this was in because I don't want to dox them or anything. And the person I was with was, just kind of nursing their drink, and we were planning on leaving and going somewhere else, but I knew I had at least 15 or 20 minutes to kill. So I ordered an ounce of don't want to dox them either, a very well-known rum distiller's 21 or 23-year-old from somewhere in the Caribbean, we'll say. And I tasted it, and the bartender came over to, I assume for me to fluff them, right? To congratulate them on pouring me this pour. They're
beautiful
like kind of like imagine wiping the glass and just kind of looking over and being like, so how do you like it? And I was
the
like,
raised eyebrow,
yeah. So how is it? And I was like, honestly, it, to quote Forrest Gump, she tastes like cigarettes. So it didn't do anything for me. Just having that massive age statement on there, it was actually one of the worst pours I think I'd ever had. Oh, yeah. And so it's something that I've come to categorically reject, but I don't think it's something like, and again, the small barrels, it's this heuristic that people apply, like, oh, you use small barrels? Oh, well, forget that. Mm-hmm. So I'm really glad that you're making the point about the cuts. And again, this is what I mentioned earlier. This is the intersection of the process and the end product and the flavor notes that we like, right? So I'm glad that we're zeroing in on this. This episode is brought to you by Near Country Provisions. And I thought that since it's a newish year, I'd share some thoughts on how switching to local farm-raised meat and line-caught seafood from right here in the Mid-Atlantic is a really solid New Year's resolution. First off, this is one of the few resolutions that'll be easy to stick to. That's because every month Near Country delivers right to your door, and they give you a ton of customization options so that you can really personalize what's in your delivery. I have literally never seen a delivery service with such good customization and add-on options. Full stop. Second, when you see the quality of this meat, from the luxuriously dark tones of their grass-fed beef to the insane marbling on some of the cuts of their pasture-raised pork, you'll know immediately that you've got something special. And that carries through on the plate with nourishing, hearty food for the whole family. I'm a new dad, and my daughter loves sampling my food when we cook up a meal using Near Country Provisions proteins. And as if that wasn't enough, you can feel good knowing that Near Country sources their food from farmers that use sustainable and regenerative agricultural practices that create healthy animals and a healthy environment in which they can roam. A great example are their eggs, which are sourced from Warrenton, Virginia, where their farm partner adheres to the highest standards of pasture-raising chickens, which means healthier birds and rich, dark yolks when you crack them open in the pan. Head over to nearcountry.com and enter the code BARCART, that's BARCART, all one word, when you sign up for your subscription to receive 2 free pounds of bacon or ground beef in your first delivery. Resolve to improve the quality of the protein in your diet and vote with your wallet to support ethical, sustainable local agriculture here in DC, Maryland, and Virginia. Now back to the show. So I'm looking at the rules that you were saying. It's gotta go, kind of below 80%. And then you were imposing another restriction on yourself in-house, which is, all right, we're going to do this narrow cut, which means we're throwing away. Now, throwing away, I'm sure that there are plenty of ways to upcycle, recycle, reuse some of this distillate. You're not just like walking outside with slop buckets and pouring it in the parking lot, but you're only utilizing for what goes in the barrel and turns into your end product a much narrower band than many distilleries would, which has cost implications for you guys, right? So like there's some unit economics involved in here, and that's a significant sacrifice to make in service of that end product. So I just wanted to call that out. But so like now that we know how you guys make both the classic Del Bac and the Dorado, that is the Mesquited, not peated, kind of resolving that initial idea. What are some of the other projects that you guys have embarked on? Because I know that there's one that we're going to talk about here that's a very new release.
Yeah, definitely. So again, we focus around this idea of being of where we're from. And while we are creating obviously I feel wonderful, consistent, high quality product, we get the good ratings, we get the medals. So it's also nice to be like, oh, well, it's not just us who thinks we're doing a good job. You always want to focus on something creative. You want to be able to give something that keeps your distillers interested. And for a long time, Whisky Del Bac had what we called our distillers cuts. And this was this idea of if we could get our hands on super weird oak, or here's a barrel that held a spirit that we think would complement one of our core products really, really well. Or sometimes let's play around with mash bills. Like, again, 4 ingredients, you're limited to malted barley, but you change the species of barley that you're using, that changes the flavor. You change the malt, you change the roast level on that malt. Every one of those things has an impact. And so the distillers cuts were these ways for us to kind of flex our muscle and to be like, yeah, we're making this consistently good core SKU that's going out and people love it. But like, what can we do that maybe is going to be maybe not as accessible or a little more interesting? And so those used to be distributed. Those used to go out to liquor stores, bars, restaurants. And this is something that I can take a lot of the blame on, was pulling those back actually. And being like, let's make these even smaller, and let's make these distillery exclusive. And I was lucky enough that I kind of pitched this idea, and was able to get some buy-in from my bosses, the powers that be, but we didn't want to completely pull back. And so these distillers cuts became what is now our whiskey club, where they are distillery exclusive. If you live in the state of Arizona, if you live in Kentucky, because those are the two states we can ship directly to consumer, you are able to get your hands on these distillers cuts. And, our fall 2022 was a heavily smoked Mesquited single malt finished in Pinot de Charence barrels. That Pinot de Charence is a sweet French wine that is essentially like cognac eau de vie, that then you add additional bits of Uni Blanc in to ferment with this spirit in the barrel. It's this beautiful, beautiful, complex wine. We were able to get our hands on a handful of barrels, finish the mesquite in it. It was unreal, just completely beautiful. But obviously then that had some backlash from customers who were like, hey, I can't get this anymore. And so we kind of went through our notes and we assessed what are some distillers cuts that we've done in the past that were huge hits, that one, we want to be able to give more people access to, but then two, also be able to be something we can do year after year. Because that's the other thing, is when you do these unique one-offs, they're not scalable. And of course, obviously we're focused on creativity and creating amazing spirits, but we're still a business at the end of the day. And so this idea of what we call our global cask collection came out of this. And this was something that long before I had ever arrived, they'd been kicking around this idea of limited releases that are the same year after year. They come out at the same time, but every year we can expand that reach. And so last year is when we officially launched the Global Cask Collection. And the first one is our Frontera. And that is our classic unsmoked single malt. And that is finished in Pedro Jimenez sherry botas. And we specifically chose PX sherry because it is this very high sugar content sherry. It is very walnutty. It's very jammy, lots of red grape skin. And I was able to taste that original distiller's cut that came out, and it was just like, it just blew my mind. Thankfully, sherry is relatively easy to get a hold of. So we were like, okay, that's going to be our spring release. So each spring, our Frontera comes out. Then we have a summer release, which is also our classic unsmoked. That is finished in Calvados barrels. I will fully cop, again, I'm a huge sucker for brandies. Especially having worked and distilled in Maryland for a while, apple brandies in particular. So similar thing, just these bright fruit notes, this apple peel, this kind of almost like freshly pressed cider note that happened in there. So that's our Normandy, and that comes out every August. And then the third one is what used to be called our winter release. We now call our Ode to Isla. So you talked about how, we didn't immediately start blasting stuff with mesquite. Well, the Dorado has evolved over the years. It used to be this very, very aggressive smoke bomb. And based on feedback we got from clients and people who came in, we've pulled that smoke back quite a bit. Still there, still present, still very noticeable, but it wasn't what it was. The Ode to Isla is our chance to go back to that. To kind of, it's our love letter to Isla Scotches. So it is this very huge, billowy, and just wonderful, and to me, beautiful smoke bomb. The attitude that I've taken since I've been lucky enough to help out with this has been, how close can we get to the edge of too smoky? Because again, especially with mesquite, it can get astringent. It can get off balance really quick. Let's push right up to that edge. And just when we think we're about to tip over, that's when we go, okay, we're going to bottle it. So that one's pretty unique because it's a blend of multiple smoked mash bills. It is finished in rye, finished in bourbon, and then also finished in second use of our own barrels. So it is this very complex, very evolved spirit. But yeah, what we're going to talk a little bit about is what we're excited about is this is our second annual release of the Frontera. This came out, like I said, this actually came out May of last year. We're releasing it in March because the demand was so high last year. We're like, okay, we're going to try and get ahead of it. But it is just this beautiful, it's kind of hard to see on the webcam, but it is this beautiful, dark copper. And has this just absolutely just kind of soft, delicate mouthfeel that obviously we're getting from the PX sherry finishes. And even with that, even within this kind of set constraint of every year's a sherry release, every year's a Calvados release, we're still playing around. We're still like, where can we source these botas from? Where can we, how many times can we use them and get more nuanced flavor on top of them? So while the distiller's cuts still exist, again, they're super exclusive now and just within Arizona and Kentucky. But we do still have this opportunity to kind of show off our blending and finishing skills with this global cask collection.
I just got to say, well, First, I'll throw in my little commentary on the Ode to Isla, which is just what it reminded me of the Danny DeVito meme. So anyway, I started blasting.
Exactly.
But no. On a serious note, I love this move, and I think it's so smart and shows the sophistication and what it can truly mean to bring in somebody who knows their stuff and infuse an existing program with a different focus and a different energy, right? Because you had this, like you were saying when you were discussing the distiller's cuts, you were talking about energy. You were saying we were literally flexing our muscles. We were burning calories, flexing muscles. That takes time, it takes attention, and it takes away from certain other things. It's a choice, right? There's only so many hours in a day. There's only so much barley in the barley silo. What are we going to do with it in any given day? And that was a decision. And so by pulling back from that a little bit, of course you're going to face a backlash from people who liked that. They didn't have to come in and make it. It just showed up on shelves and they liked it. Cool. But what I love about this bifurcation between the Whiskey Club and the Global Cask Collection is that you're saying like, oh, okay, like we've been around for like 12 years now. We've got our feet under us. We can do a little bit more consistently. We have all this data about what was successful in the past. We can kind of do this. And another thing to mention is that you're not taking all the magic and the mystery out of it, because you still do have those annual challenges that are going to be slightly different from year to year. Where are you going to get your casks from? It's going to differ. Are those heat fluctuations going to be as radical one year? Is it you going to have a warmer winter or a cooler winter with greater swings? Like there are still some terroir related unknowns in the game, and so for me, that is the draw of having a Frontera release and a Calvados release and an Ode to Isla release every year. And just getting back to the mesquite smoke, something I've been meaning to just kind of put out there for you, because I don't think we've quite given the mesquite all of the attention it deserves here. It's weird to me that mesquite is like a flavor note that you almost have to back your way into from barbecue, right? Because we get mesquite from barbecue. And so few of us have actually like smelled a pan of burning mesquite chips, unless you've actually made barbecue, which I have. But yeah, isn't that kind of weird? Like that most of us know mesquite not in a vacuum, but only in the context of like stuffing our faces full of sweetened pork.
It is. And again, I think that's what speaks to how unique mesquite is. And another thing, we haven't quite touched on is, Tucson was the first UNESCO City of Gastronomy in the US. And that is because, Tucson has been consistently settled, the Tucson area, from, the indigenous Americans to colonization to now. It has been one of the longest steadily settled areas of the country. And that through line can be seen within the city from a cultural aspect and especially from a culinary aspect. And because mesquite is so ubiquitous in this area, you have mesquite furniture, you have mesquite flour from the pods that are on the trees. You have the mesquite pods can be used as kind of like a sweet little dessert treat. And so it kind of makes sense that in terms of how we think of mesquite, it is for better or for worse, infused within the idea of culinary, that it is used to cook meat. It is used both in American culinary cooking. It is used in indigenous American cooking. It is used in Mexican American, in Sonoran Mexican. Like, all of these different areas utilize mesquite in very distinctive ways. But yeah, it is within this context of sustenance and of barbecue and of it. Just, yeah, it's another reason I think that it speaks to Stephen and Elaine's vision of something that is of the Southwest, and that is maybe not known in context of whiskey, but is certainly known within context of food.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's endlessly fascinating to me. I mean, I think you've wound up in, as we said, by way of other roads, but I think you've ended up in a really special place. And it seems like, just based on some of the changes that you've been describing, you've really been able to, flex your own creative muscles there. And so for listeners, what we do have to share is that we will be getting a bottle of this year's Frontera release, and that will be featured in our spring new and noteworthy session. So we've got a bottle coming, and we'll probably drop in a clip or two from this conversation into that episode when it does air, when we get to record that with some of the other spirits that folks have been sending our way. But Mark, I wanted to wrap this up. Let's do the bookends here, because we started talking about some of these. We got deep fast. We got into rules and regs and gossip from the TTB about where we stand currently with American Single Malt. And so I want to return back to, that tuning fork of my conversation with Lance Winters, because one of the things that we were so optimistic about, this was 3 or 4 years ago that we had this chat, was how wide open the category is, and how well suited it is for people to explore and try new things and, enjoy the freedom of the open frontier, as opposed to the hard walled borders of a geographic designation of origin. So what do you think the future holds for the category of American Single Malt? And I mean, obviously we've just learned by way of example some of the things that Whisky Del Bac is doing, but I don't know, maybe this is just a chance for you to extrapolate a little bit and put on your philosopher's hat.
I think actually you hit the nail on the head by the fact that it is kind of a frontier, and I say that as a very good thing. Like, that is not meant to be a disparagement of frontier as untested waters. It is. A couple of years ago at the American Craft Spirits Association annual conference, the American Single Malt Whisky Commission got together, and there was a presentation given on kind of just a summary of here's who's making American Single Malt. And one of the most striking things about that presentation was the gentleman who was giving it brought up 2 maps. One was a map of Scotland. And it was like, okay, here are the average temperatures of Scotland. Here's the average humidity of Scotland. And there was maybe 5 to 6 degrees variance from various areas of Scotland in terms of like temperatures fluctuation. And then he brought up a map of the US. And so you had this kind of very blue turquoise map of Scotland, and then he brought up the map of America, and it was green, blue, bright red, yellow, orange, because we have this massive space within to make American Single Malt whiskey. And, I'm a big believer in, I think, the TTB eventually accepting this and establishing this designation. It helps validate what we're doing within the American Single Malt space. It is a nod to what we're doing is legitimate, that it is a real spirit, that it is a real whiskey that deserves attention. It, can help filter out bad actors that, for better or for worse, be like, oh, this is an American Single Malt. Well, technically it's not, because you sourced it and it has to come from the same distillery. And also, even though there are these specific designations of how it has to be produced, every single distillery can make their own version of it. And I think, and I say this as a person who's distilled bourbon in the past, who has distilled rye in the past, who loves rye still, I think sometimes you lack that variety in the bourbon and the rye market, that a bourbon is still going to taste like a bourbon for the most part. And you have those outliers that do really creative things that can kind of break that mold. But, I just sat in on a panel that was single malts from Deer Hammer in Colorado, Cedar Ridge in Iowa, us, Balcones in Texas, and to sit and taste through these 5 different single malts, none of them tasted the same. Like, every single distillery was able to make production decisions, aging decisions, and finishing decisions that you taste that and you're like, this is the same spirit. Like, we're all following the rules, but every single one was so of its space. And I think that's where you'll see this continue to evolve, is you will see distilleries, and, more and more distilleries are making an American single malt, that they're going to find that thing that defines them. And, I think something that has made me excited in the craft space in general is the quality just keeps getting better too. For a long time, you would fight that kind of idea of, oh, well, you're a craft distiller, so your stuff must be garbage. Well, no, there are a lot of us who know what we're doing. Unfortunately, there's some not great stuff out there, but
we try and weed it out little by little every year, man.
Exactly. But I think that's where the future is, and I think that's kind of the nice thing about this designation is how wide it is, because while it does give these guidelines on how it has to be produced, everything else is up to you as a distiller. And to me, that's the exciting thing is, even let's narrow it down. And I had mentioned Santa Fe Spirits and their Cole Keegan. That is a Mesquited American single malt. It tastes nothing like our Dorado. It is, because it's the production styles are different. And so I will always tell people, grab that bottle. We have a bottle of Cole Keegan at work. And when people are interested, I'm like, well, how else have people done Mesquite? Or like the Balcones has done a Mesquited. Like, grab those 3, taste them side by side.
Yes,
there is going to be something for somebody in there.
Right. And to me, like, I'm here in DC, Jack Rose, go to Jack Rose. And now you can have a 3-pour flight of Mesquited American single malt. And to me, like, once you can do that and sense that variety within that very narrow, very specific, like, production and category sliver, like that, to me, like that says something. And so I couldn't agree more with everything that you've said. I will just drop this in. I have a favorite, and it's a very esoteric favorite, country and spirit category with a set of rules. So it's not just a geographic indication, but it's also a set of process-based rules as well. Guess? I'll give you one guess.
I'll
give you a base. Grape.
Oh, well, we've already talked about, so it's grape. I'm not going to say cognac because that's just too obvious. Armagnac?
Pisco.
Oh, see? Okay, yeah.
So
I went Eurocentric. That's on me.
Well, so what I love about Pisco is, so I just had a recent interview with the gents from Suyo Pisco, and they're going around and they're sourcing from individual distilleries all over Peru, not just around Pisco, but like all over the place. And they're focusing on lesser known producers. And the thing about Pisco is that they've got they've got way more grapes that they can utilize than in cognac, for example. So a lot more diversity there. And they've got this crazy diversity of geography. There's some right down by the ocean. There's some crazy high elevation, some nice low valleys. Like, there's a lot of variation there. And then they went and they stuck this one really crazy thing in where it's like, but you can only run it through the still once, which is a huge process restriction, right? So I love that set of rules to me because it's perfect for Peru. For whatever reason, the stars aligned, and when they set those guidelines, they set themselves up for such success in that they've got lots that they can do, but they also have something that makes them real unique. And I'm not saying that the American Single Malt Whisky Commission should base their sets of rules that they're trying to get passed through the TTB on Pisco, because we're not Peru, we're America. We've got, like you said, the heat map is different. But I do, I love to mention that when people are talking about geographic indications and process-based regulations, because it can be done well. It doesn't always get done well, but it can be done well. So to me, that seems like the opportunity here. So I want to get to a couple of quick lightning round questions, but before we do that, is there anything else that I've egregiously passed over when it comes to Whisky Del Bac, Mesquite, American Single Malt, any of the above?
Other than just, I want to make sure that, obviously our co-founders, Stephen Paul and Amanda Paul, get the shout out. And, I'm standing on the shoulders of the distilleries at Del Bac that came before me. Nathan, who was the original head distiller, Veronica, who I took Veronica's place because she actually moved back east. Ironically, I came west. She went back east too. And
Ironically.
Yeah, ironically. And I inherited an amazing production staff. And, it's been great to have the freedom to kind of, again, be able to do some of my own creativity, but, I'm standing on their shoulders and I'm incredibly thankful for that. And just, I would encourage people, if you haven't explored American Single Malt Whiskey, you really should. It can be a little difficult to find because most of us who are making it are pretty small producers, but what is out there is really, really good. And it's a huge honor to even be a part of kind of this burgeoning whiskey designation.
Yeah, you hear that, bourbon nerds? All the cool kids are hanging out with the American Single Malt. So you take your 3 flavor notes. We'll sit here with all the flavor notes in the rainbow. So with that, we will of course link to all the stuff, all the socials, all the websites on the show notes page, modernbarcart.com/podcast. But for now, let's jump into the lightning round. First question is going to be your classic desert island scenario. You get to pick one bottle and then one cocktail that you either have all the ingredients for or is just sort of magically on tap in this no prospect of rescue situation. Interpret the rest of the rules however you wish.
So bottle, Balvenie 14 Caribbean cask.
Ooh, I got that for my dad for Christmas last year. That's a goodie.
It is my go-to. We talked about like introducing people to an entire spec of whiskey. The Balvenie 14 is what I tell people. You think you don't like Scotch? Try this. It is. I will put it even head over tails over their 21 year. Like that is my go-to. That is my go-to dram. Ironically, then that doesn't play into my cocktail though, because my go-to cocktail is going to be a Sazerac. Because we talked, the first time you and I sat down on this program was talking absinthe. And I still have a love for absinthe. I still have a love for that complexity. And I'm a sucker for rye whiskey. So yeah, just being able to get that little bit of herbal note complexity from the absinthe wash, but then you lean into it with especially a really big, bold, spicy rye. Yeah, that's gonna be a Sazerac. So, then put the finger on me asking what rye. That's a better question. But those would be that would be my cocktail in my bottle.
I love it. That is so you. I love that. I love that Balvenie reference. Shout out to them. All right, this is a special lightning round question just for you. Something that our listeners may not know is that you are a connoisseur and a lover of animals, and specifically now distillery cats. So
yes,
do you have some at Del Bac? Yeah,
we have one. We have Turo. Yeah, the running joke is she was hired to be a mouser, retired about 5 years ago, didn't tell anybody. So now she's a mascot.
I love it. Well, so you've got this great distillery cat / mascot. Now, if you were called upon to create the ultimate distillery cat, what would it look like? Any powers? Like what would you design this bizarre animal to be?
Oh man, I feel like I'm going to get in trouble with staff if I don't say Turo is the peak distillery cat. But okay, so like if we're kicking it out there, so
Yeah, you're exporting this cat to a different distillery.
right. Sorry, yeah, Two-Row, we're not getting rid of you. You'll continue to get fed every morning. So our cat, my wife and I's cat, Rump Roast, he is a Tom who is fixed. So he's got the big chunky tomcat cheeks. So you got to start with the big chunky tomcat cheeks because it's adorable. I've become a big fan of kind of the traditional tabby look, what we call our standard issue cat. So we're doing big chubby cheeks. We're doing standard issue cat markings. Let's get some white paws on there, kind of go hot rod style.
Oh yeah.
I'm going to be honest, as much as I love Two-Row and as much affection as I will give her, being able to actually hunt and be a mouser, take care of pests, that would be a huge advantage. And then, at the end of the day, cats can be standoffish, but, Two-Row, again, I'm going to come back to her. She has leaned into the mascot. She's friendly. She likes when people come to see her. You got to get that public facing PR marketing gist. So I'm thinking big, chunky tabby, hot rod wheels, super friendly, and can actually catch mice.
Very nice. Very nice. Yeah. Yeah. I like that. You gotta have both the yin and the yang, like eviscerate vermin and then show up for a little scritch.
Exactly.
So well done. Well designed. Is there anything in the distilling or spirits or cocktail space? We've mentioned that you've been doing this distilling gig for a number of years now. Is there anything that you've changed your mind on?
Sourcing product. Actually, I will fully cop that I have come 180 on that. When I first started, I was one of those jackasses that was, if it's sourced, it's illegitimate. It's only craft if you mill, mash, ferment, distill, age, blend, and bottle. And I think a lot of that attitude came from there were a lot of bad actors that were in the sourcing space for a long time, that, it's just by pure coincidence, everyone's grandpappy's recipe happened to be 95% rye from MGP, huh? That's a coincidence. Mm-hmm. So I will admit, when I first started, I would beat that anti-sourcing drum. And I've turned around on that because, independent bottlers, places like Lost Lantern and Barrel, have shown when you do it transparently and you do it thoughtfully and you do it in a way to create something that is different, then that can be something brilliant. And so I actually have a whole newfound respect for distilleries that, and also understanding the financial restrictions. Like that's been a big thing too, is understanding it is so expensive to do own make. And I think I kind of touched on, for the first 11 years of our existence, Whisky Del Bac was American Single Malt. Last fall, we released a rye. It's a sourced rye. It's a sourced rye from MGP, but we finish it in our Dorado barrels, and then we filter it across mesquite charcoal that's produced during our malting process. And we're clear on our label. Our label is incredibly transparent. We say this was distilled and aged in Indiana. But this is what we did to make it different, because we didn't want to just take someone else's juice and slap our label on it. And so obviously, that has had an influence, but the longer I've spent in the industry, the more people I've met who do sourcing in a thoughtful, transparent, and innovative way. I've gained a lot of respect for that. And I'll fully admit that has been a 180. That 7 years ago, I never would have thought you would get me on a recording saying that.
Yeah, that's a great one. And I couldn't agree more. Last lightning round question here. You're a transplant to the current ecological niche that you inhabit. What is your favorite American Southwest desert plant, animal, or mineral in the Tucson area?
So animal, the javelina. So these are things that I wasn't even aware of until we moved down here. Javelinas look like pigs. They're not pigs. They're part of a species called peccary, but they look like wild pigs. They are adorable. They are horrific to smell, and they just run everywhere. And they are the coolest, uniquest animal. And in fact, my wife and I were just at an arts festival this weekend and got some wrought iron javelinas that are going to go out in our front yard, and it is entirely possible that they will get knocked over by javelinas as they come rooting through.
Nice. I love it. That's a great answer. Great answer. Well, Mark, I mean, I've had a blast, as expected. We are very excited to review and taste through the 2023 release of the Frontera that is heading our way. So more fun and more value yet to come from this conversation. Is there anything else that you wanted to say before we sign off here? Any requests from the listeners? Any final words of wisdoms? Any good knock jokes?
Oh God. So no, it's been an absolute pleasure as always. We're, shameless self plugs. We're on all the social medias at Whisky Del Bac. One thing that I am incredibly excited about after a couple of years being gone, we're back in Maryland. So we are available in Maryland. So that's a shameless, hey, if you're in Maryland, you can get your hands on us now.
And was that through LibDib? Is that correct? Bartenders? So bartenders in Maryland bar programs, of whom I know there are some listening, go to LibDib, and that's where you're going to find these Del Bac products. So hit that up. Mark, again, just thanks so much for sharing your expertise. I really love the mental zones that you inhabit. They give me a lot to think about and a lot to, take notes on and eventually go away and maybe form some of my own conclusions about this emerging category on. And thanks most importantly for being my guest again here on the Modern Bar Cart Podcast.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Eric.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, there's two big things you can do for us here at Modern Bar Cart. One would be to tell your friends and family if you think they'd enjoy listening to us talk about cocktails. And if they don't download podcasts, they can always stream our episodes on their desktop directly from the show notes page at modernbarcart.com. The other thing you can do to help would be to head on over to iTunes or wherever you download your podcasts and leave us a review. 5 stars are great, but we're more interested in your feedback. And the beauty is, the more reviews we have, the easier it will be for other folks out there to learn about our show. We're trying to start a cocktail revolution here, and by spreading the word, you're helping us fight the good fight. You can always reach us by emailing podcast@modernbarcart.com if you're looking for cocktail or bartending advice, or if you're a pro who would like to pull up a mic and be interviewed for all to hear. Also, definitely follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Modern Bar Cart for cocktail porn, recipes, and entertaining tips. And keep an eye out for new product releases and special offers, which are happening all the time. We love our listeners, and we really enjoy giving you exclusive discounts and sneak peeks at our latest and greatest cocktail projects. This episode may be over, but for you, the mixological fun and adventures are just beginning. So remember, folks, drink responsibly and experiment boldly. This episode was made possible with editing and sound design by Samantha Reed. American Single Malt insights courtesy of Whisky Del Bac head distiller Mark Vierthaler, and a little bit of interview magic by yours truly. This has been a Modern Bar Cart production, copyright 2023.